Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your daily deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Chris, and joining me as always is Laura.
Hey, Chris, great to be here. And I have to say, this week has been absolutely wild for anyone watching frontier model releases, because the cadence has shifted into something almost unrecognizable.
That's exactly where I wanted to start today, because OpenAI dropped GPT 5.5 on April 23rd, 2026, and the API followed one day later, putting it 6 weeks after GPT 5.4.
6 weeks, Chris. 6 weeks between major frontier model releases from the same lab, and this is not just a tune-up or a minor capability bump. This is being described as the first ground-up retrain since GPT 4.5.
Help our listeners unpack that phrase, though, because it gets thrown around a lot, and people might not appreciate what a ground-up retrain actually represents in terms of cost, time, and raw engineering effort.
Yeah, so when we say ground-up retrain, we mean OpenAI essentially started over with the base model weights, rather than fine-tuning or distilling from an existing checkpoint, and that is a multi-$100 million undertaking by any reasonable estimate of compute, data preparation, and engineering staff time.
And the last time they did that was GPT 4.5, which means the entire GPT 5 family, up to this point, was actually building on the same foundational base, and now we are looking at genuinely fresh substrate, which is a really significant shift.
Exactly. And that distinction matters because it suggests OpenAI hit some kind of ceiling with the previous base. And they made the bet that a new pre-training run would unlock capability gains that incremental work simply could not deliver.
Let's dig into the benchmarks then, because the numbers I'm seeing are honestly striking, especially around long context reasoning, where they more than doubled their previous performance on a single high-profile metric in just one release cycle.
That is the MRCR version 2 benchmark at 1 million tokens, which jumped from 36.6% to 74%. And that is just not the kind of leap you typically see between sibling models in the same family.
Translate that for someone who doesn't live in benchmark land, because the headline number is impressive, but I want to understand what doubling MRCR actually means for somebody using GPT 5.5 in their day-to-day work.
Sure, so MRCR essentially tests whether a model can find and reason about specific information buried inside a massive context window, like asking it detailed questions about a 1,000-page document and seeing if it tracks the small details across the whole thing without losing context or making things up.
So at 1 million tokens, going from 36% to 74% means the model is suddenly genuinely useful for things like full code-base analysis or whole book reasoning, instead of just nominally supporting that long context window on a spec sheet, but failing in actual practice.
That is the practical takeaway, yes, and it pairs with their Terminal Bench 2.0 score of 82.7%, up from 69.4 on the prior model, which is huge for agentic coding workflows in production.
Speaking of agentic capabilities, the OS World Verified score came in at 78.7% and CyberGym at 81.8%, which both speak to the model actually operating software end-to-end with real reliability.
Right, and those are the benchmarks that matter for the agent economy that everybody keeps promising. Because if you want a model to drive a browser, navigate a desktop, and finish multi-step tasks reliably without supervision, those scores are the leading indicator of real-world success.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate for a second, because all of this sounds incredible. But OpenAI also doubled the API price overnight, and that changes the value calculation for a lot of people building real products on this.
Yes, the new price is $5 per million input tokens and $30 per million output tokens, up from $2.50 and $15 on GPT 5.4, and that is a meaningful and immediate cost shift.
And then GPT 5.5 Pro, which is the higher accuracy tier, sits at $30 per million input tokens and $180 per million output tokens, which is genuinely premium frontier model territory now.
It is, but OpenAI is making an interesting argument, which is that the model is more token efficient, meaning it solves the same task with fewer tokens. So the effective cost increase is closer to 20%, not 100%.
I want to push on that claim because token efficiency is one of those things that sounds great in a launch post, but is really hard to verify until your team has actually rebuilt their workflows on the new model in production.
Totally fair, and I think the honest answer is that for some workloads, the efficiency gains will absolutely materialize. And for others, particularly those already optimized for terse outputs, the doubled per token price will simply land as a doubled monthly bill.
So enterprise buyers are going to be running their own evaluations over the next few weeks. comparing total cost of completion rather than just per token rates, and that is the metric that should drive procurement decisions in any rational shop.
Exactly. And I think we'll start seeing that data show up in vendor decks, in evaluation harnesses, and probably in some very pointed CFO conversations once people see their April and May invoices come through with the new pricing applied.
Let's talk about the competitive frame, though, because GPT 5.5 is not landing in a vacuum. And Claude Opus 4.7 from Anthropic is still in the market with some of its own very strong claims.
Right, and the head-to-head is genuinely interesting because GPT 5.5 takes the lead on Terminal Bench, OS World, MRCR, Long Context, and CyberGym, while Claude Opus 4.7 still leads on SweBench Pro and SWE Bench Verified.
So if I'm a developer doing pure repository-level coding tasks, Claude is still arguably the best in class. But if I'm building agents that operate computers and tools across long contexts, GPT 5.5 clearly edges ahead.
That's a clean way to frame it, and I'd add that on the Artificial Analysis Intelligence Index. GPT 5.5 tops the leaderboard at 60, which is the highest aggregate score they have ever recorded for any frontier model to date.
And one more detail I keep coming back to, which is that GPT 5.5 matches GPT 5.4 per token latency in real-world serving, despite being a much larger and more capable model under the hood when you peek inside.
That is a serious infrastructure achievement, Chris, because typically when you scale up parameter count or reasoning depth, latency degrades noticeably, and OpenAI has clearly done a lot of work on inference optimization to keep response times effectively constant.
Which probably ties into the partnership announcement that GPT 5.5 is now powering codecs on NVIDIA infrastructure, suggesting some pretty deep co-design work between OpenAI and NVIDIA on the actual serving stack and silicon level.
Yeah, and NVIDIA has been talking about this for a while, the idea that next-generation models require co-designed silicon and software to actually be economically viable at the scale that OpenAI now operates, particularly for inference workloads where margins really do depend on every millisecond and every watt of efficiency you can squeeze out.
Let me zoom out for a moment, because the thing that strikes me most about this release is not any single benchmark, but the cadence. The fact that we are now getting major frontier upgrades every 6 to 8 weeks consistently.
That cadence is genuinely new, and I think it represents a real strategic shift. Because for most of the GPT-4 era, we saw maybe 2 major releases per year, and now we are looking at 6 or 7 big jumps annually.
And it raises a question for enterprise buyers, which is, how do you actually build a stable production system on top of a model that might be deprecated or significantly changed within just 2 months of you shipping it?
That is the existential question for AI platform teams right now. And I think the answer is that you build abstraction layers that let you swap models in and out, rather than coding directly to any single vendor's API surface.
Which is also where standards like the Model Context Protocol become really important. Because if your agent infrastructure is portable, then a 6-week release cycle from one vendor is an opportunity for upgrade rather than a real existential threat.
Exactly. And that's the macro shift I'd want listeners to take away, that the velocity itself is reshaping how teams architect AI applications, and the winners will be the ones who design for change rather than for any kind of stability.
I want to spend a minute on the safety story too, because OpenAI made a point of saying this release came with their strongest safeguards to date, including extensive red teaming for advanced cyber and biology capability domains specifically.
They worked with about 200 trusted early access partners before release, ran the full preparedness framework end-to-end, and added targeted testing on the higher-risk capability domains, which is roughly the same playbook Anthropic has been running publicly.
And honestly, that level of pre-release testing is becoming table stakes at the frontier, because the regulatory pressure and the public scrutiny are both pointing in the direction of more disclosure and more rigorous capability evaluation across the board.
It is, and I'd argue that is actually a healthy development for the industry, because 3 years ago, we had no shared norms around what frontier launches should look like, and now we are converging on something that resembles responsible release practice.
Let's talk about who actually gets access to GPT 5.5 right now, because the rollout matters for understanding adoption velocity, and OpenAI has been very deliberate about which user tiers get the new model first this time.
Sure, so GPT 5.5 is rolling out to ChatGPT, plus Pro Business and Enterprise users, while GPT 5.5 Pro is gated to Pro, Business, and Enterprise tiers, with API availability for all developers across both variants.
That tiering tells you something about OpenAI's strategy, which is that They want power users and enterprises on the Pro variant, where they can charge premium prices while keeping the base GPT 5.5 accessible to broader consumer audiences.
And I think we'll see usage patterns split accordingly, with the base model becoming the default for most consumer and developer interactions, while Pro becomes the go-to for high-stakes coding, deep research, and the most complex agentic workflows.
One thing I'm curious about, Laura, is whether you think GPT 5.5 Pro will actually justify its 6 times higher price tag for enterprise customers, or whether most teams will end up using the base model for everything.
My honest read is that for most workloads, the base model will be plenty. But for the top 10% of tasks, things like complex code refactoring or deep research synthesis, the Pro variant will pay for itself fairly quickly.
That is roughly how we saw the dynamic play out with the original GPT 4 versus GPT 4 Turbo Split, where most usage migrated to the cheaper option, but the premium tier retained a profitable niche of genuinely high-value work that justified the substantially higher per-call cost for the right kinds of tasks.
Exactly, and I think the pattern is generalizing across the industry now, which is that frontier models now segment into a workhorse tier and a specialist tier with very different price points and very different ideal use case profiles.
So as we wrap up, what's the one thing you want listeners to walk away with about GPT 5.5 and what it signals for the broader trajectory of the AI ecosystem in the remainder of 2026?
I'd say 2 things, Chris. First, the long context reasoning leap from 36 to 74% on MRCR is the real story here, because it unlocks workflows that simply weren't viable before. And second, the 6-week cadence is now your default planning horizon for any serious AI strategy.
That is a great place to land. And I'd add that anyone building products on these models needs to read OpenAI's release notes very carefully, because the pricing changes and capability shifts have real implications for unit economics downstream.
Agreed, and one more thought to leave folks with, which is that we are now firmly in a multi-frontier model world, where Claude, GPT, DeepSeek, and Gemini are all contesting the same enterprise contracts every 6 to 8 weeks.
That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, everyone, and we will see you next time with another deep dive into the AI ecosystem stories that matter most to your business and strategy.